Welcome again to the 2013 Australian Open Chess Championships. Kerry Stead speaking, and we're bringing you coverage today of the round 6 games from the Australian Open Chess Championships from North Leagues in Cammeray. As usual, we wish to thank our sponsors, Hancock Prospecting, North Leagues, Ridges North Sydney, Australian Chess Enterprises and Chess Discount Sales. Turning to the games from round 6, we're going to start with the Board 3 clash between FIDE Master Junta Akita and International Master George Z. Junta's white starts off with Knight F3, George replies Knight C6, D4, D5, C4. So we've effectively transposed into a type of Chigorin Queen's Gambit. Bishop G4, Junta takes on D5. George takes the knight on F3 first before recapturing on D5. And then breaks in the centre with E5. Junta follows up with Knight C3, Bishop B4 to pin the knight, Bishop D2 to break the pin. George swaps the other bishop for the other knight and then trades on D4. So we have a bit of an unusual position that we are 10 moves into the game and we've already had two minor piece trades. So we've got Junta with the two bishops, we've got George with the two knights. Obviously Junta has a slightly compromised pawn structure with the doubled F pawns and the isolated A pawn and H pawn, whereas George still has his basic 3 and 3 on either side. In terms of how the play develops, it's interesting to see this imbalance right from very early on in the game and how it then develops from here. Junta brings his bishop to D3, both players castle, and George centralises his rook on A8. Bishop then goes to E4, hitting the queen. Queen goes over to G5 to check, king runs out of the way, and queen goes to H4. Junta pushes F4, so now he has all these central pawns there on dark squares, and the rook comes up to D6, so there are now ideas of swinging the rook across to H6 with obvious checkmate threats on H2. Queen F3, F5 to attack the bishop, it goes back to D3, King H8, Rook B1, B6, the rook now goes to C1 to attack the knight, and the rook swings across to H6 threatening checkmate on H2. Junta defends and they trade queens on G3. Then the knight from George comes into D5, so he's now protecting the C7 pawn, so the knight on C6 can potentially move. Junta centralises the rook and helps protect the E pawn. George brings one of his rooks around to attack it as well. Junta now finds a very nice tactic to win a pawn. He plays bishop takes F5, obviously attacking the rook on E6, and after the rook takes F5 there's a pawn fork with pawn to E4. George retreats his rook and Junta captures on D5. George trades a pair of rooks, and then because of the back rank threat he's forced to play knight E7. Bishop comes to B4 again, attacking the knight, and again because of the back rank threats George is forced to play knight G8 to try and defend those. D6 by Junta to try and get rid of one of those doubled central pawns. Recaptures with the bishop, fairly obvious, and then brings in the rook to E6 to help defend. Knight comes to F6 and the bishop comes back to a very solid square on E5. Now there's again potential threats of maybe taking the knight at some stage, and obviously either disrupting that pawn structure because of the back rank mate threats, or just simply creating further problems for George. So here Junta is a clear pawn up, has a very strong bishop, and should be a technically winning position, but Junta finished it off fairly efficiently from here in very nice style. Kings come to G8, rook goes across to C6 to control the only open, well, one of the open files on the board. Knight jumps into D5 and then Junta starts centralising his king. a3 to prevent any little tricks with knight b4. Knight comes back to e7, the rook retreats on the c file. Knight comes to f5 to attack the d pawn. Junta hits it with g4, so obviously if the knight takes on d4, Junta's then going to play rook d3 and pin it to the rook on d7 and win it. So knight has to retreat back to d6, and again the king is brought further to the centre. After the rook's attacked, it goes to d3, and again George also centralises his king. The knight's forced back again, and the king is centralised in on e4. Knight comes to d5 to try and blockade that d pawn. Pawn comes forward to f5, checking the king, and then h4. So Junta's starting to get that majority on the king side rolling. Pawn goes to a6, potentially looking to create a pass pawn on the queen side, but Junta continues with the king side push g5. Pawn to g6, and another very nice move here from Junta. Pawn to h5. Obviously if George takes on h5, he's got a very simple plan of just playing rook h3 and rook h5 to pick up that pawn, and he's left himself with obviously a passed f pawn, a very weak h pawn for George, and potentially two passed pawns combined with that d pawn that George is already trying to stop. So George takes the f pawn, king takes, knight goes to e7, and the king returns to e4. Big change now is that there's now an f file open for Junta to attack with the rook as well. King comes to e6, rook f3, so threatening mate on f6. Knight comes to d5 to prevent that, and then pawn to g6. Again, that majority on the king side getting pushed and really put into action quickly by Junta. So swaps on g6. George moves the rook back to d8. Junta simply pushed the pawn to g7. So pretty simple from here. He's just going to play rook f8 and promote. So this is where George resigned, and a very, very impressive performance by Junta in that game, and that kept him actually in the equal lead at the end of the round with Igor Henkin. The next game we're going to look at is actually something of a theoretical duel between Tony Davis and Carl Zalesko, apart from being a very interesting game in its own right. So Tony started off with knight f3, d5, c4, d4, and we've got a sort of reversed Benoni type position. Very similar to, or at least early on, the game that Junta played against Igor Henkin in one of the earlier rounds that ended up in a 100 plus move draw. This time Carl plays pawn to f6, which is one of the more challenging lines to this system, with the idea of obviously playing e5 and establishing a strong pawn centre. e3 from Tony, e5 from Carl, so we're threatening the b4 pawn, so Tony plays pawn to c5. Carl plays a5 to try and undermine that. Bishop b5 check, c6, and bishop c4. And this is where the theoretical duel kind of happens. Carl takes on b4, and Tony plays what is a sacrifice here. Knight takes e5, which has been played on at least 3 occasions that I'm aware of, and this is also theory from actually a recently published book on the ready by Delchev. And Carl plays a move that is not the accepted theory, plays a novelty. The accepted theory previous to this game was knight h6, with the lines continuing knight d3, bishop f5, and from here, depending on the game, it's either knight to f4, knight a6, bishop b2, d takes e3, f takes e3, and knight takes c5, which was from a game between Fluvia Puertas and Ibarra Yerez from last year, 2012. Or alternatively, after bishop f5, you can castle as white, take on e3, bishop takes d3, and that was first played in 2008 in the game Class Hermann. as well as being played by Arane's Murillo against Kleck in 2012. All of these games, the 2008 game turned out to be a draw, but the 2012 games were all won by black. And from this position, again, Delchev recommends playing knight h6 in this position. However, Karl decided to play a very aggressive move, which to some extent is probably going to upturn some of this theory. He played pawn takes the knight on e5, and somewhat reminiscent of the old Damiano defense to e4, e5, knight f3, f6, we have queen h5 check coming in. Here the line that Delchev gives is king d7, queen f5, a couple of checks, queen takes the pawn on e5, there's a bishop e6 coming in, and it's all very ugly for black. However, this is Karl's novelty here. He plays g6, and as I'm sure one of the early tricks you learn is that there's a fork with a queen on e5. Karl's obviously not bothered by all this and plays queen e7. Tony takes the rook in the corner and then plays knight f6, and this is the dilemma that Tony now faces, that the queen on h8 hasn't got anywhere to go. He decided to castle, bishop e6, not only blunting the pressure on, blunting the c4 bishop, obviously developing a piece. He wants to try and basically get the king out of the way, preferably on d7, and then just play bishop g7 and win the queen. Pretty simple plan, and there's not really a lot Tony can do about it. Pawn to d3, swap on d4, king d7, rook d1, and bishop g7, and the queen is trapped. So Tony's actually forced to give up a whole rook to save the queen. After rook takes d4, king c7, he's forced to play queen d8 if he wants to try and save any sort of material here. So Karl just calmly swaps off the queens, captures the rook, and he's now a piece for 2 pawns up, and Tony obviously has problems with the double c pawns and the diagonal being a real issue at the moment. So bishop b2, so there's no issues on that long diagonal. Knight d7, a3, takes on a3, and Karl's obviously happy to trade pieces here. Knight e4, so the pawn on c5 is falling. f3, knight takes c5, knight d2, and Tony decided that he'd had enough. Obviously the extra piece is really going to be telling Tony really doesn't have any play in this position, and the queenside pawns are just going to be pushed, and they're going to win the day for Karl. So a very impressive game got by Karl. Very interesting theoretical battle, and a well played game, and a possible overturning of accepted theory in this position. So something of a warning for those of you who buy books expecting them to be up to date. This is actually overturning theory from a book that only came out at the end of last year. So very recent developments that are still already out of date. To finish off, just a few very quick games. This is between Okdong Jargul Sengaravdan and Jeff Kabilan, and Jeff starts off fairly quietly and obviously looks to undermine the Sengaravdan centre later on. However, he never really gets that chance. So after some fairly normal looking developing moves, albeit that Jeff seems to be a little bit cramped at the moment, after castling, things suddenly go south, starting with h4. Kabilan tries to break in the centre with e5, but that opens the diagonal. Bishop c4 check, king's forced to go to the corner. h5 attacking the knight, which doesn't have many safe squares, so knight has to come into f4. The knight swapped off for the bishop, and then the knight goes to h4. Obviously now we're threatening knight g6, and if pawn takes, pawn's going to recapture, and it's going to be mate with the rook on h1. h6 to give the king a square on h7, but then simply queen comes into g4. Kabilan tries bishop d6, however that's not good enough. Knight g6 check, King h7 and Queen f5, and it's all over very quickly. We're obviously threatening Knight f8, followed by Queen h7 mate, and it's extremely difficult to stop. So very nicely finished off game very quickly there by Seng de Rabton. And finally, to finish, Trevor Teo, one of who hasn't probably had the best tournament so far, really punishes a bit of an unusual move in the opening from visiting Danish player Henrik Mortensen. Starts off as a Caro-Kann, and Mortensen plays the unusual, shall we say, pawn f5 in this position. Tau swaps on d5 and brings the other knight out to g3, knight f6, knight e5. So Tau's immediately looking to exploit the hole on e5 created by that move by Mortensen. Knight c6, bishop b5 to pin it, bishop d7, Tau swaps on c6, the other knight comes to f3 to support the knight on e5. Mortensen jumps into e4 with his knight, and now knight g5. Obviously there's a big threat on f7, so Mortensen is pretty much forced to swap off that knight. Bishop recaptures, so now Mortensen has the issue of how to actually develop. He'd probably like to play pawn to e6 at some point, but obviously with the pin it's a bit difficult, so pawn to g6 to develop the dark squared bishop. Tau simply castles, queen c7, rook e1, finally pawn to e6, but now bishop f6 attacking the rook in the corner. Rook to g8, king to d2, bishop d6 to try and get rid of that menacing knight on e5. Rook c1 preparing a c-pawn advance. Rook b8, and now queen h6. Obviously we're threatening the h7 pawn, so Mortensen plays queen c8 to defend it with the queen on c7. Now the pawn comes to c4 to try and open up the c file. Bishop f8 to attack the queen. Queen returns to e3. Mortensen plays queen b7 to get off the c file. There's an exchange on d5, and then knight c6, obviously again attacking the rook on b8. The rook goes back to a8 where it's safe, and then a rather unusual but fantastic move here, knight d8, obviously attacking the queen. It's also adding to the pressure on e6. Queen to d7, and then simply knight takes c6, and after the queen takes, a very nice finish to the game. Rook takes c8 check, removing the defender of the queen, and as a bonus it's going to be obviously Mortensen's forced to play either rook takes or king d7 or king f7, all of which all failed. The queen takes e6, next move with mate to follow very soon. So bit of a disastrous opening for Henrik, but really very well played by Trevor, and he seems like the type of player that you definitely don't want to give the initiative to. That's going to wrap up the video for round 6. At the moment we have two leaders, Junta Akita after his win that we looked at earlier against George Z, as well as Igor Henkin, who are both on 5.5 out of 6 and leading the event. And once again, if you're unable to make it to the venue, the best way to follow the tournament is on the tournament website. You can see the address there, the Google site. Easiest way to get there is through the North Chess Club site, northsydneychess.org. That's got all the information you need. It's got results, it's got pairings, it's got games, it's got other things there, so go and check that out. Or alternatively you can follow my blog on melbournegamescoach.blogspot.com, and hope to see you for the next video.